Thank you for joining us today for our discussion of part of the civil rights movement. I say part of the civil rights movement because it is too all encompassing to, of course, include in one lesson. So please make sure that you do your reading and that you do your own outside research. You may find that something you see in here piques your interest to look up something else. So please do so. This time period is too important to simply relegate to a 30-minute lecture or one web page. So let's definitely check it out. This lesson will be a little bit different in that we're going to talk about several small parts so that we can get a capture of small elements of a larger movement. So that makes it again necessary that you continue to look at your readings and other sources that you have. There are several videos that will be included in here. They will not be in this video, but the links to those videos will be provided. So let's begin. Look at this image. I'm a man. What's the significance of these four words that are on these posters? This is an iconic American image. Of course, they're men holding the picture, holding the signs in the picture. We can see that, right? But what does that mean? I am a man. What do they want? What are they hoping for? What are they not getting that America promised them? That's what we'll be talking about today. So, as we begin our look at the civil rights movement, we're going to talk about a person whose death really galvanized the civil rights movement, and that's Emmett Till. Emmett Till was from Chicago, and he was visiting family down south. And unfortunately, he was brutally murdered when a white woman accused him of whistling at her. He was murdered by her husband and brother-in-law. The important thing about this death, and something that will shock the nation, is that when his mother holds the funeral, she decides that there should be an open casket. She wants the world to see what these men did to her boy, is what she says. And images of his mutilated body shock people, but even more powerful were images of mourners at the funeral when they see his body. This is something that sadly happened all too often to African Americans in the United States. But Mamie Till's desire for the world to see what happened is really going to galvanize the movement. It's going to get it kicked off in a way that maybe nothing else could have. When we talk about civil rights, it's also to remember that civil rights is not just something that happened in the 1950s to African Americans and it was solved by the mid 60s. Civil rights are human rights. They're equal rights for everybody. So let's talk about some origins of civil rights. When we go back to the end of the Civil War, way back to the very beginning of the semester, we have three amendments that came out of the Civil War, and they're called the Reconstruction Amendments. They're the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. An easy way to remember them is if you think about people chanting, "Free citizens vote, free citizens vote." The 13th Amendment, of course, freed people from the bondage of slavery. The 14th Amendment defined citizenship as a United States citizen and said that African Americans were not just free, but indeed citizens of the U.S. with the rights that every other citizen was entitled to. And the 15th Amendment gave Black men the right to vote. So that's our first origin. Another thing to think about, which is actually the opposite of civil rights, was Plessy versus Ferguson. And this was an 1896 case where Homer Plessy in New Orleans is riding a train car that is segregated. Plessy is arrested. He files suit, and the Supreme Court rules against him. They say that it was okay for New Orleans to have separate train cars for separate races. They said that was okay as long as things were separate but equal. So they could have a black car, they could have a white car, as long as they were equal. Now we know in reality that those cars, those schools, everything that would emerge would not be equal. But unfortunately, this case will pave the way for legal segregation for another 60 or so years in the United States. We get images like this, right, where we have segregated restrooms, lunch counters, waiting rooms, buses, trains, everything throughout the South, and even in some northern cities too. When we talk about civil rights, remember we're talking about rights for everybody. So women are included in civil rights. And in 1920, women finally gained the right to vote. So with the 15th Amendment, Black men could vote, but of course, no woman in the United States could vote. So by 1920, with the 19th Amendment, all people in the United States over age 21 could vote. However, we'll see there were some hurdles faced by Black voters throughout the South. Let's skip ahead to the 1940s. We have some things that come out, especially of World War II and its aftermath. In 1948, Harry Truman desegregated the military, and this happened right before the Korean War would break out. So he desegregates the military in 1948. Just a couple of years later, the Korean War starts, and that would be the first war where black and white soldiers fight side by side. Something unique at the time was that it still shows the prejudice and the lack of scientific evidence, but blood was actually segregated, not by blood type, but by races. So there was still a ways to go. That same year in Texas, there was a lawsuit in which Mexican American students could no longer be segregated out of schools from white students in Texas. So, what we're going to see throughout the civil rights movement is this small, incremental, step by step change. It's not like one big thing happened, it's these little steps that often pave the way for something even larger to happen. So it's kind of unique to see this, right? So before this, there were places like in San Antonio where my grandparents and great grandparents grew up, where there would be maybe three different schools. There would be a white school, a Mexican American school, and an African American school. So after Delgado v. Texas, schools now there's just two schools. There's the white Mexican and everybody else school, and there's the African American school. So see, this is one of those examples, right, where we see some change, but not full equality all at once. Another Texas event, also in 1948, was the founding of the American GI Forum. Dr. Hector P. Garcia had served in World War II, and what he found was that African American veterans were not getting the benefits to which they were fully entitled. So he founds this group in Corpus Christi that then becomes powerful statewide and even nationwide to ensure that Mexican American vets get what's due to them. Okay, moving forward a year, we go to the University of Texas. And again, so we already saw one school segregation case. I know you know of another, but here's one that maybe you don't know about. So in 1949, there was the Sweatt versus Painter case. And what happened was Herman Sweatt was a law student at the University of Texas, which is one of the nation's premier law schools. Well, Sweatt was able to gain admittance to UT Law, but his classes were segregated. The professors he had were segregated. The library he went to was segregated. And Sweatt sued the university president saying, this is not equitable. This is not fair. And Sweatt wins. He wins his case. So right now we've had two different education improvements. Okay, let's look at some more cases. We'll see that a lot of times, right, laws are made, but also courts rule. And that's one way when we think about our branches of government and our separation of powers, right? It's the ability for courts to say something is not constitutional that will often force change before lawmakers or governors or even presidents are ready. Now, here's a case in Texas again, Hernandez v. Texas. And there was a man named Pedro Hernandez. He was on trial for murder. And spoiler alert, he did commit this crime. He was not a good guy. But what happened, if we go backwards quick, is that he's on trial in Jackson County, Texas. He's convicted. He appeals to the Supreme Court. And in 1953, the Supreme Court is debating, okay, is the court system, is that fair to people of different races and different ethnicities? So Jackson, Texas, we can see kind of around Victoria. Maybe some of y'all are from there. And what was unique, not only in this part of Texas, but throughout the South, is that juries were segregated. They often had all white juries, so no person of color served on a jury. And in this case, no Mexican American had served on a jury panel in over 25 years. So this case goes to the Supreme Court, and it actually involves maybe one of the most random questions of the time that is debated in the Supreme Court. We can see that the courthouse itself was segregated, including the bathrooms. And so Tom Clark, who was a Supreme Court justice from Texas, he's there as part of the debates when the other justices are debating, and they're saying, well, okay, this courthouse has segregated restrooms in Texas, but how do you know? And someone legit asks this question of Clark. Clark, you're from Texas. What does a Mexican look like? Because they're trying to decide, is it obvious that somebody's Mexican American? Do they look different? How do they know if they're in the right bathroom or not? How do they know if they'll be on the jury or not, right? Is it the way they look? Is it their last name? So we have this, what seems like a silly question to be asked of a Supreme Court justice, but it really shows the racial attitudes of those in power at the time. What the court finds is that all white juries are unconstitutional, that it violates a defendant's civil rights, right? You cannot get a fair trial if it's not truly a jury of your peers, people who look like you. So, another court case, Brown versus the Board of Education. This is one that probably everybody knows, and this is one of the most important Supreme Court cases in American history. The case went before the Warren Court, and there were several plaintiffs in the case. It was not just Brown versus the school board in Topeka, Kansas, but they lumped a bunch of similar cases together, and they just went with the first name, which was alphabetical, Brown. What the court decided after looking at evidence was that idea of separate but equal was fundamentally flawed, that schools can never be separate and equal. They had witness testimony at the time where they looked at psychologists and they saw how this segregation affected children. And what they said was, right, children are harmed by segregation. They had studies where they would show a black doll and a white doll to children, and they would say, which one is nice, which one would be your friend? And even the African American students in this study, they picked white doll as the good one and the black doll as the bad one. So this witness testimony helped the court realize, right, that separate schools could never be equal, that schools had to integrate. Here's an interesting story on segregation on buses from somebody who was an actual participant. This is Gwendolyn Middlebrooks. I was privileged to attend an interview with her in Atlanta a few years back. She was literally the babysitter for Martin Luther King Jr. So she grew up in that part of Atlanta. She knew the family. And this is an interesting take. She talks about how Martin Luther King Sr., so they called him Daddy King, how he would say, kind of give young people a way to subtly fight back against the prejudice that they experience. For example, in buses, when they did have to give up their seat to a white patron, they would, you can see from this, they would leave their books on the seat. So that would kind of encourage white patrons to move. The law didn't say anything about moving your books, right? So this was a subtle way that young people were able to act and bring about a little bit of change, right? Getting back their seat or getting to sit next to their friend. As we think about the bus boycott, we really think most of Rosa Parks, right? She is the person that we think of. And this is from her arrest warrant. So we can see the warrant itself was fairly short. It just says that this woman was not giving up her seat. Well, Rosa Parks, we know the basic story of the Montgomery bus boycott, but we may not know the full story. Rosa Parks was a seamstress, but she was also active in the NAACP. And the NAACP in Atlanta had been searching for a while for a way to challenge the segregated buses. What could they do? They had been looking for somebody as a test case that had been arrested or would be arrested to make this thing a bigger issue, to draw it to the city's attention. And at first, they actually settled, or before they settled, there was a teenage girl who was an unwed mother, and she and several other people before had been arrested for not giving up their seats, but they thought that she would not be as sympathetic of um, as sympathetic of a person, right, to be arrested and then to build this movement around her. Now, we might think today, how could you force a young mother out of her seat? But the fact that she wasn't wed at the time made the NAACP of Atlanta kind of think, well, we're going to hold off on this boycott. We're going to look for someone else. And so they came to Rosa Parks. The story we often hear, maybe in stories you read in elementary school, was that Rosa Parks was tired and that she got arrested on the way home. And that makes it sound like she was this poor old lady whose feet hurt and she just had a long day, and she got arrested because she just didn't have the energy to stand up. Well, that's not the case at all. This had been planned. Rosa Parks had previously been subjected to this one particular racist bus driver. The way it worked was you entered, if you were black, the front of the bus to put your money in, and then you had to go back out that door to the back door and enter through the back. So you couldn't even walk through the very front of the bus if you were African American. And so Rosa Parks previously had her money stolen. When she put in the money, started to go to the back, this bus driver drove off. And she said for years, when she would be waiting for the bus to come home, when she would see that particular bus driver, she was like, nah, you know what? I'll just wait for the next bus because I don't want to deal with that guy because he's such a terrible person. Well, Rosa Parks, the NAACP had been planning it. And this one day when they're getting ready, Rosa Parks is on her way home. And guess who's driving the bus when it pulls up? It's that guy. And when she sees him, she's like, no, this is the day. This is the day when I'm going to make my stand by sitting down, right? When I'm going to make this an issue. So that's the bigger story. She wasn't tired from working all day and her feet hurt. I mean, that could have been the real, a situation too. But she was tired of segregation. She was sick and tired of the situation, of the laws, of just the way society was working in Atlanta. That's what she was tired of. And we know that Martin Luther King Jr., who was a young preacher at this time, this is really the first place where he makes his name known. And let me backtrack. I think I said Atlanta before. We're talking about Montgomery, Alabama, right? So Martin Luther King Jr. had come to Montgomery, Alabama to run this boycott, and they're successful. But for over a year, people did not ride the bus. They carpooled, they walked, they had kind of people who coordinated giving each other rides by phone. So this was not an easy thing to do. But the point of a boycott, right, is you make your point known with your money by not giving your money, in this case, to the bus company. It's important to know the full story behind it. There are some early legislative attempts at civil rights reform. And so in 1957, we have a Civil Rights Act that is proposed. However, it is significantly watered down in the Senate. So it's the first attempt to really ensure that those voting rights that had been supposedly granted to African American men since after the Civil War and expanded to include all women in 1920, that those rights were actually realized because there were tons of ways that you were kept from voting if you were black. It's significantly watered down by conservatives, including Strom Thurmond, who was a senator, and he leads, you might hear about this, a filibuster. A filibuster in the Senate basically gives you as a senator the power to talk for as long as you can physically stand up and stay on the floor of the Senate. So he talks for 24 hours to not defeat the bill, but severely water it down. It's signed by Eisenhower, but again, it's maybe a baby step, but it's not exactly what would come. It's definitely not what would come later. It's not exactly what proponents wanted at the time. So back to education. Now, we said in 1954 that the Supreme Court ruled in the Brown case that schools had to integrate. So how long do you think it would take, right, for schools to do that? Should they do it immediately? Right in the middle of the school year? Maybe you give schools the benefit of the doubt and you say, you know what, we'll give you, till this school year ends, but when the next school year starts, right, then it should definitely be in full effect, integrated schools. That wasn't the case, though. A lot of states were dragging their heels. They're purposely going slowly, saying, we're still studying, we're still looking. So 3 years later in Little Rock, Arkansas, we have 9 students called the Little Rock Nine who are chosen really to attempt to integrate Central High and Little Rock. So they go to school, they try to go to school, but they're not successful. As these young adults walk to school, they are met by mobs, they're spit at, they're cursed at, things are thrown at them, and they're physically unable to go to school. So they go home, right? The next day they try again. They can't get to the school for fear of their lives. Well, President Eisenhower, he can't have this, right? He can't have state governors and mayors in the South ignoring the law. And so he sends the military to escort these young adults to school. Think of this surreal scene, right? What is that like to see the military having to take you to school safely? What does that mean? They can't be with them all the time, right? They're in the hallways, but they're not in the classrooms. They're not sitting next to them at lunch protecting them. So it really shows the bravery that the Little Rock Nine exhibited in their quest to integrate Central High. They are, of course, successful, right? It's forcefully integrated, but states in the South will start to realize that they can't drag their heels anymore. And we slowly get more integrated schools. Now, going forward to an interesting case, we talk about voting, and literacy tests were ways that people were kept from voting. So as we look at this test, this is kind of unique, but this is showing you, this is just one example from Louisiana. And this was like a 30, 40 question test. And just look at these questions for a second. It says you have 10 minutes to complete it. If you get one wrong answer, you fail. So on its surface, it sounds like, okay, you have to be able, a literacy test, you have to be able to read to vote. Maybe people think that's a good idea. Is this a reading test? Is this seen if you're as smart as a 5th grader in Louisiana at the time? No, it's not. This is designed to be tricky, to get you to fail. You can Google these, you can search these up on YouTube, but it really shows the links to which Southern voting registrars would go to keep African Americans from voting. And guess what? Although this says this test has to be taken by anybody who couldn't prove a 5th grade education, if you were white and walked up to attempt to vote, you did not get this test. You either didn't get a test at all or you got something super simple that would be easy to pass. So we see that there's discrimination in schools. Now there's discrimination in voting. Something will have to be done. Fast forwarding to another site of segregation, and we have Segregation in neighborhoods. There's an important woman named Daisy Myers, and she's called the Rosa Parks of the North because she doesn't integrate schools. She doesn't integrate buses or restaurants. She and her husband integrate an actual neighborhood. At this time, if you were African American, you could not buy a home in a neighborhood. She is able to. However, she and her husband face intense discrimination as they're trying to live there. And so they live in their neighborhood for a few years. But she's another important person that's often untold or underappreciated in her work to integrate, in this case, a neighborhood in the North. It proves that it's not just the South, right? Although the South had laws and plenty of racists, well, guess what? They existed in the North too. So that's why it's important to know about Daisy Myers. All right. So as we come to the end, again, the videos will be linked. Definitely need to check them out. We have the 24th Amendment. So we've moved from the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote. That's an example of civil rights, to the 24th Amendment. And this deals with voting, like we said. Another way that people were kept from voting was through poll taxes. Besides the literacy test, you actually had to pay to vote. You had to pay a poll tax when you showed up to vote. And so there were still 5 southern states that had this. And of course, they applied it only to African Americans, not to poor whites. But the 24th Amendment is going to abolish poll taxes. So here we have this other significant, in this case, an amendment to the Constitution that will help to ensure voting rights and more equitable representation in government. We'll talk more about these things in the future. Like I said before, it's important to read about and to know these things. Don't just watch this. Look at the linked videos, make sure you do your reading, and just find stuff on your own, because without the heroes that fought and continue to fight today, we wouldn't have the rights that we have. That's why it's so important to remember them. I want to thank y'all for watching. This presentation was made exclusively by me. All rights are reserved.